Workers, when did a new employee cause a mass firing/quitting among the other staff? To start with, I didn't want to be there in the first place. It was 5 on a Monday morning, but my dad insisted. It was freezing cold, the glass on the front windows of the store was fogged over where you couldn't see out except for a little peephole beside the door that I scraped clean with my fingernail. You see, he owned the butcher shop in the small town we lived in at the time. This particular morning, my dad wanted to spend some quality time with me while he shouted at his employees and I worked the cash register because the girl that normally worked was out of town visiting her aunt. My dad is always loud and obnoxious, his mustache wiggling with indignation about the slightest thing, but this morning he was particularly agitated. The new assistant butchers were all in the back staring nervously at each other as my dad barked out instructions, his hands clasped behind his back and under his apron. My dad prided himself on a job well done and preached quality over quantity. The day went without a hitch until right around lunch when a particularly loud crash from the back made me jump. I waited for my dad's yell but heard nothing. I finished waiting on the customer at the front and cautiously made my way to the back of the store. I gingerly pushed open the door to the cutting room and tilted my head around the door. Did I really want to know what had actually happened? It had to have been terrible for my dad to have lost the ability to speak. I stuck a foot in the room and peered around the door with one eye. Then I froze, taking in the scene before me. There was so much red. It covered the floor, splashed up on the counters, splattered on the wall, and covered everything in sight. A giant metal bowl teetered back and forth on the floor, the metal clanging against the floor. 3 assistants stood frozen, poised with red on their aprons, coating their shoes and splashing their pant legs. My vision swung to the left to see my dad standing there, staring open-mouthed at the scene. He reached up and wiped some red splatter off his forehead. His fists clenched and he positively vibrated with rage. The top of his head began to redden and he sputtered angrily. He stalked up to each of the assistants one by one and ripped their aprons off. He held them in his fist and shook it angrily under each assistant's nose before throwing the apron down in the bloody mess on the floor. He shook his head and motioned to the door, throwing his hands in the air. Quickly, 3 men exited shamefacedly, nearly tripping in their haste to get away from my angry father. I still stood in the doorway staring as my dad turned in circles looking at the massive mess that covered his once pristine floor. And that is the story of how 3 people got fired without my dad ever saying a word. How on earth are you going to tell this story and describe that scene without telling us what happened? It sounds like 3 employees quit and the 4th lost their job just before that, if you catch my meaning. I had been working at the restaurant a while. 4 months into my job as a hostess, I was pretty settled in the routine of the place. The work was fairly easy, the people were nice to work with, and I had really nice hours. We had 2 managers. They were lovely managers. As long as you did your job, they wouldn't bother you. That was until the new manager came along. We will call him John. John was an older man, balding, and with the biggest chip on his shoulder. His pants hung low, inciting comments from customers on occasion. He also talked really fast and hated repeating himself. Whenever the restaurant gets new blood, everyone is wary of the person for a little while until the newbie proves himself to be competent. John walked around like he was king of the restaurant and liked to tell everyone how to do their job. He was cocky to the point of annoyance and possibly the worst communicator in history. One night, we were particularly busy and understaffed. Instead of calling in more servers, John insisted we all work harder. He mouthed off to 3 veteran servers and oversat each restaurant section until we had people walking out the door. He sounds like the manager from hell, right? It gets worse. One of the servers had had enough of John and cussed him out in the kitchen, loud enough for customers to hear. She let him know exactly what she thought of him in very colorful language while we all stood frozen in shock. After bursting into tears and screaming some more, she calmly returned to her tables, apologized, and continued with her service. Later that evening, John called the waitress into the manager's office where he rebuked her actions and told her she should be fired. When the server tried to leave the room, he blocked her way and held the door handle, refusing to let her leave. As she became insistent, he exited the office and locked her in for a few minutes, supposedly to let her cool down. When the server exited the tiny office space, she was a crying mess and promptly left the restaurant. We were all just shocked at the turn of events and stayed quiet, hoping to stay out of John's way that night. The next day, the server was back and she talked to our other manager, telling him the situation and apologizing for her indiscreetness, but also condemning John's behavior. Our other managers were shocked and angry and called John in to talk to him. In the end, the server turned in her 2 weeks' notice when the other managers decided not to fire John. She insisted she would not work with such a horrible person. She served out her 2 weeks and left. 2 days later, John was arrested on assault charges and was fired. First off, those other 2 managers are kind of trash for not getting rid of John, because locking her in an office and whatnot is crossing a line. Second, the fact he was arrested for assault is the kind of fairy tale ending I was hoping for, so thank you. It was snowing lightly the day it happened. I worked in the coffee shop next door to the ski lift. I will leave the location unnamed for obvious reasons. Every day I would take coffee into the ski lift operators and chat with them a bit. One day, something really bizarre happened. The chief ski lift operator went missing. The other ski lift operators told me this story and laughed about it, but it was no joke. Don, as we will call him, was the main ski lift operator on one Saturday morning. He was a young guy, presumably with money, and he was good-looking enough that all the girls flirted with him. One girl in particular, we will call her Daisy, frequented the ski lift quite often, and every time she rode the lift, Don would flirt with her and sometimes even ride up with her if her accompanying seat was empty. The other guy on duty would normally cover for him. This particular day, Don had the keys to the ski lift in his pocket. Daisy and he flirted like they usually did, and he hopped on the lift with her to ride up while his partner operated the lift from the bottom. Halfway up the mountain, Don and Daisy were heavy into their conversation when the ski lift stopped. At first, they thought nothing of it, but then 10 minutes passed, Daisy was getting cold, and Don was panicking about being caught by his boss. Down on the ground at the bottom of the ski lift, things were getting complicated. Don's partner was having some manual difficulties. The ski lift needed to be restarted from inside the control box. This would have posed no problem, except Don had one of the only 2 keys to the control box. He was suspended in the air with no way to get down, and his boss had the other key. His partner on the ground was panicking. He didn't want to lose his job, and he didn't want to make Don lose his either, but there were several passengers stuck on the ski lift, and unless he figured out something quickly, he was surely going to be fired. In the air, Don was waiting for his partner to figure something out. Luckily, it was the end of Don's partner's shift, and the 2 other guys that were supposed to be relieving them showed up just as Don's partner was about to take an axe to the control box. They quickly stopped him, and one of them called the boss. 30 minutes later, the boss showed up, furious because 15 people had been stuck up in the air for almost an hour at this point. He produced the key and opened the box, restarting the ski lift and operating it himself. Don said goodbye to Daisy at the top and began the slow descent back down. Once he hit the ground, the boss strode up to him and held out his hand. Shamefacedly, Don handed over the key, and the boss handed it to the 2 guys whose shift had just started. Then, Don and his partner were escorted off the premises. Please like and subscribe if you've made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the video and have a wonderful day. I worked at a business for a number of years as a manager, and I was transferred one day to a new store. No one knew me, and I had no respect given to me by my new employees. 1 month in, I was working one day and watched 2 of my employees whispering to each other before noticing me and quickly hurrying away. This was just one of the small inconsistencies that I had been noticing. Another month passed, and inconsistencies were beginning to become consistently inconsistent. I did not know if they thought me stupid or hoped I would not catch on, but I did. I had made a list and cataloged every incident that warranted suspicion. Nearly every employee I had was under review. I knew I could not legitimately get away with firing nearly every single employee under my watch without contacting higher management, no matter how much evidence I had. So I did. I took all the data I had collected and presented it to my boss and let him know that if he didn't do something soon, he was going to be robbed blind. Every single employee under me was stealing from the store. After much debate, my manager agreed that we had to do what was necessary to keep the store in business. I returned to my store and for the next few days acted like nothing had happened. I called a meeting and discussed the money issue, stating that someone was stealing from the store, hoping that someone would speak up and I wouldn't have to fire them. But no one did. The next day, my manager arrived at the store. When he walked in, I noticed a lot of nervous glances and a few glares my way. I simply shrugged them off. I'd given them a chance, and they hadn't taken it. He took them all into the office, and I followed, standing by the door casually as he told them all what I had found. There were several explosive moments, and even one where one of the ladies tried to attack me. One of her friends pulled her back, and they calmed her down while still shooting hateful looks at me. I felt bad, but if I just continued to stand by and let them get away with what they were doing, I would have lost my job too because the store would have had to close. As it is, nearly every single person under my management was replaced, and I had to interview and hire new people. The moral of the story is to not steal or cheat your job out of money. Don't bite the hand that feeds you. I'm not usually one to side with bosses in business because I'm just a rebel like that. But yeah, I'm sorry, if every employee is just stealing the store into ruin, that's pretty stupid. It was a warm summer day. The sun was shining brightly outside and the birds were chirping. In the small town where I lived, jobs were few and far between, so for one summer my senior year, I worked at an insurance company. My aunt got me a job there. She was head insurance agent and office manager. My job was to file papers because the office hadn't gone digital yet and probably never will. I had to sort, organize, and file tons of data and files every day. Everyone in the office was friends of a sort. We all got along, but my aunt was kind of like the general in command of all of us. She acted like we were her soldiers with guidelines we had to follow. One specific day, she and one of my coworkers got into a little spat. My aunt is planning on retiring eventually, and the coworker that she fought with is the one planning on taking my aunt's job. My aunt is very old-fashioned and is not computer literate at all. Because of this, the whole filing system of the agency is out of date. Well, my aunt and coworker got into it one day, files get lost, and my aunt blamed my coworker for trying to take shortcuts. The coworker was adamant that shortcuts needed to be taken because doing things the way my aunt was doing was taking 15 years. I found the lost file, but before I had a chance to show it to them, my aunt had accused my coworker of unladylike behavior. I turned around and they were squared off like two cowboys in a western street. Me and the third coworker were simply staring, waiting to see what would happen. It wasn't the first time these two had butted heads, and the other coworker and I practically ate popcorn and watched the scene unfold. My aunt sat in her desk chair, her legs primly crossed and her skirt pulled modestly over her knees. The other coworker had her hands on her hips going at it. Then, all of a sudden, the door opened and in walked the agency's boss. The two arguing looked up startled, and me and the third coworker nearly choked on our surprise. The agency boss looked aggravated and he motioned them into his office, telling them if they couldn't agree to disagree and behave like civilized individuals, then something would have to be done. Minutes later, both women walked out of the office and stalked to their desks, gathering their belongings. As they exited the building, the head manager walked out of the office and grinned. We looked at him questioningly, and he explained that he had fired them. Immediately, I started to panic, thinking my job was in jeopardy. But then he turned to me and said he was rehiring them tomorrow, they just didn't know it. Me and the third coworker started laughing as he exited the building. The very next day, my aunt and other coworker made their way back into the building and sat grumpily at their desks. They didn't talk to each other for a week. I feel like firing someone for a day to teach them a lesson is probably illegal or something, but it still put a pretty big smile on my face. Frankly, I think your aunt needs to get with the times, though. Computers are the future. Look at me! I'm in all of your computers right now! The future! Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.